Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Sophie, and I am very excited to be moderating today's panel on language, multilingualism, and translation in research. I would like to begin by acknowledging and celebrating the first Australians on whose traditional lands we meet, and pay my respect to the elders past and present. Given today's topic, I think it's important that we reflect on the long history of multilingualism and diversity of language in Australia, with over 250 Indigenous languages, including 800 dialects that we need to keep alive and celebrate. Today, we will be discussing the value and challenges of multilingualism and researching and working in foreign languages. Firstly, we'll be learning about our panelists' personal experiences with learning and researching in foreign languages, and then discussing how to turn an interest or skills in a language into a career. And then lastly, we'll be exploring the importance and impact of multilingualism on our panelists. If at any point you have any questions for our panelists, please send them through in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. Your questions are a really valuable and important part of the discussion, so please do send them through at any time, and we will make sure that we leave time for them at the end. Today, I am joined by 5 multilingual panelists who have extensive experience in learning, teaching, researching, and working in foreign languages, and they cover the globe with their language skills. Joining me first is Cameron Allen. Cameron is a graduate policy officer at the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. While undertaking a Bachelor of Laws and Bachelor of International Security Studies at the ANU, Cameron studied in Indonesia and Singapore as a New Colombo ASEAN Fellow. He's also the CEO and co-founder of the ASEAN Australia Strategic Youth Partnership. Thank you, Cameron, so much for joining us. Hi, Cameron. Next, we have Leslie Barnes. Leslie is a senior lecturer in French studies at the ANU, where she teaches French language, Francophone literature and film, and convenes the Global Vietnam Field School. Her research area of expertise is French-speaking Southeast Asia, and she has published extensively on Vietnamese and Cambodian authors and filmmakers. Thank you, Leslie, for making time for us today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Next, we have Alice Dawkins. Alice is a senior associate at Ledecka, a boutique consulting firm with a focus on Asian economies. While an undergraduate student, Alice completed 2 honours theses, which took her to Southeast Asia for extensive in-country fieldwork. Her thesis in Asian Studies was awarded the ACT Federation of Graduate Women's Prize, while her law thesis was funded by the New Colombo Plan and will be published with Cambridge University Press. Thank you, Alice, for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Next, we have Nicholas Forelli. Nicholas is Professor and Head of Social Sciences at the University of Tasmania. He was previously the Associate Dean of the ANU College of Asia and Pacific and the Director of the ANU Myanmar Research Centre. His research focuses on the political, social and economic development of Asia, and he is the co-founder of New Mandala, a leading online forum in Southeast Asian studies. Thank you, Nicholas, for joining us today as well.
Sophie, it's great to be here.
And lastly, we have Gemma King. Gemma is a senior lecturer in French at the Australian National University. Her research centres on language, culture and power in contemporary Francophone cinema and cultural studies. She has published in both French and English on subjects such as the representation of sign language, multilingualism, post-colonial histories, immigration and multiculturalism on screen and in museums. She's also a member of the Executive Committee of the Australian Society for French Studies. Thank you, Gemma, for making time for us today.
Thank you.
Well, I think given today's topic, the best place to start is for our panelists to share what languages you speak and why you started learning those languages in particular. If anyone wants to kick us off.
All right, I'll kick us off based on the order of introductions. Hi everyone,
Thanks,
nice
Cam.
to be here. No problem, Sophie. So I study Indonesian. I started learning, funnily enough, at primary school. I had a great Indonesian teacher. And then when I went to high school, they were only teaching French or German. So I was like, nah, they're not languages for me. But when I got to university, I knew I wanted to study languages. I had enrolled in my security studies degree, and I went up to my lecturer and said, listen, like, I don't know which languages I want to speak. What language should I learn? And he said, Russian or Indonesian. So I chose Indonesian. And yeah, now I'm where I am today. So unfortunately, not a grand, compelling story to it, except that I suppose at a very early age, I went to a primary school in Newcastle that was called Hamilton Public School Children of the World. And it was a school that had a very strong ESL program. So a lot of recently resettled migrants or refugees in Newcastle went to my primary school. So growing up, learning a bit of Vietnamese, Chinese, Burundi was quite normal. So I think that's what kind of inspired my interest in language, and my journey learning Indonesian and getting involved with Southeast Asia has been a really fabulous experience. So yeah, that's a bit about me.
I'll go, following alphabetical order, and also drawing on childhood experiences. I did not grow up in a multilingual environment. I grew up in Dallas, Texas, which was fairly monolingual in the 80s. But when I was in kindergarten, two girls moved into my neighborhood and joined my class. One was from Vietnam and one was from Cambodia. And I should mention I speak French, Vietnamese, and Khmer. And so I don't really think, I mean, in a way, that was the moment where I realized there was a world outside Dallas, Texas. I mean, it's a strange thing to remember in your life when you realized that there was a world. And it's not as though I said at that time or any time after that, oh, I'm going to learn Vietnamese and Khmer to honor these girls that were in my kindergarten class, actually with whom I grew up. But at a certain point, that just kind of, I realized that was the path I was on. I started studying French in high school. Neither Vietnamese nor Khmer were proposed as options in high school. And so I started French because the teacher was a playwright and a circus clown. And again, I thought, that's very not Dallas. That is something outside this milieu, and I'm gonna go that way. And so so it really is just sort of, it just evolved over and then at a certain point I realized, oh, these there's something here, there's some kind of synergy here, and that's when it sort of became something professional. But really it was sort of contingent for me.
I'll respect the alphabetical surname and go next. So I grew up in a sort of a small place where language learning was your ticket out of there to go on to exciting international things. So at school, I did French and Chinese. I had monolingual parents, but multilingual grandparents who, my maternal grandparents spoke Hindi, Urdu, and deliberately did not teach it to their kids because they didn't want anyone to understand what they were saying. So I was always conscious that language could be a really fun device to have secret conversations and unlock all these sort of new worlds. I've never learnt Hindi, Urdu, and I'd kind of like to at some stage, but the next language I did was Burmese, which Nick Farrelly actually told me to do when I was a second year at the ANU. So glad to have a few connections on this panel. And that I'll go to, I think Gemma's next. Well, no, sorry, Nick, you're next.
Yeah, I'll jump in next then Alice. And it's really great to be involved in this conversation, and a credit to you, Sophie, and the rest of the organisers for pulling us all together for the conversation today. I started out, like others, when I was young and in a pretty standard, straightforward suburban existence, was bamboozled from the beginning by our teacher librarian, who was fresh back from an Australian volunteering stint in Indonesia, and he decided to get all of the 5 and 6 and 7-year-olds learning Bahasa Indonesia, which, you know, at that stage, so this is again suburban Australia in the 1980s, that was exciting. It aligned with a range of other political and cultural forces of that moment. And when I reflect on some of the stalemates around language education in Australia right now, it's intriguing to consider what was required to get small children, as I was, focused so intensively on Indonesian language learning. I then ended up spending a lot of time focused on studying Thai and Burmese and some other languages along the way. But it was really that first experience, opening my eyes to some different worlds, utilizing culture and cuisine to get small children enthusiastic about some realms beyond their own. And in my judgment, that's often where so many of us have taken taken our cue from those who can be inspiring figures in our lives. And I still think incredibly fondly of that teacher librarian and the path that he perhaps unknowingly set me up on. Over to you, Gemma.
Thanks, Nick. We've all kind of come from a background in which, you know, primary school experience were really fundamental, and mine was the same experience. I grew up in Melbourne in a monolingual family environment, but I went to a Steiner primary school. And apart from doing a lot of rainbow paintings and communing with our spiritual sides, every course or every sort of topic that we studied throughout primary school was studied through a cultural lens. So every year had a different theme. And we would study math through that theme, and we would study science and literature through the kind of cultural prism of whatever the year's topic was. And so we learned a little bit of language every year, and it's not like I speak these languages now, but I mean, class 1 was Native American languages. Class 2 was Hebrew. Class 3 was Egyptian hieroglyphics and ancient Egypt. Class 4 was German. Class 5 was Hindi, and then class 6 was French. And so I had this background of like really appreciating and being curious about other cultures, even if we were just dipping into them at a surface level. But once we hit French, just something clicked for me. And I'm shamefully bilingual compared to the wonderful plethora of other languages people speak on this panel. But I'd like to think that I still have that curiosity about other languages. I mean, I work on multilingual cinema as my primary focus, and have started learning Auslan and French Sign Language. And even though my only sort of fluent languages are English and French, I hope that that multilingual, multicultural approach continues to inform my work.
Thank you so much for sharing, everyone. I think it's very clear that languages offers this totally different perspective and the opportunity to really consider the world, you know, beyond just, you know, the country that you're living in, and consider really broader global perspectives. I'm curious then how you made the transition from an interest in a language into a research interest, and whether it was something that you wanted to explore the, you know, themes within that country, or whether it was something that you sort of had the language first and then that sort of led you to sort of explore more cultural lenses.
I'll start. I mentioned that I studied French in high school, and I continued in uni, and I will admit I was not very gifted in French. Like I tell my students this all the time, I was a solid, you know, credit distinction student. So don't despair at this stage. When I finished uni, I decided to go to Hanoi, Vietnam to teach. Again, like not sort of reaching back to these early experiences and not quite knowing how they shaped my trajectory, but I decided to move to Hanoi to teach English. I finished undergrad with a psychology degree and knew that I did not want to continue that path. So I saw a few years in Vietnam as a way to sort of reset and figure out what to do from there. And it was in Vietnam that I discovered the historical relationship between France and Vietnam and colonialism. And it was on the streets of Ho Chi Minh City where I bought my first copy of Marguerite Duras's L'Amant. I mean, it could not be more cliche. And I thought, right, it just sort of the path kind of emerged in front of me. I thought, this is what I want to do. I want to stay in this space between France and Vietnam somehow. And so I moved home from Vietnam and spent 6 months in Montreal working on my French, getting my French up to a level I thought I could take it to a graduate study level. And then so I spent 2 years in Vietnam. And because I lived in Vietnam, I felt it was necessary to speak Vietnamese even before I decided to make a career or to use it professionally. So I had enough Vietnamese to feel that I could then take it also academically. And so when I started my grad studies in French and Francophone literature, I made Vietnamese part of that study and spent summers studying with the Southeast Asian Studies Summer Institute in Wisconsin. I spent a summer in Vietnam with the Vietnamese Advanced Studies Institute, and really started trying to consolidate both languages as languages that I could, that would allow me to work in this Franco-Vietnamese space. And then it's just kind of evolved from there, really.
I'll jump in next then, Sophie. So the language that I first used for academic purposes was Thai, and I benefited from a remarkable education at the ANU as an undergraduate, tremendously well mentored. And then once I landed on my honours year, I was using Thai language material really intensively. And when I look back on it, was quite remarkable that there I was with the sort of background that I was bringing to bear, using Thai language source material to try to understand what was going on in some of the really messy political and ethnic situations across the border from Thailand in Myanmar. And this is going back many years now, but it was a particular kind of academic project, and one that I think the ANU, to the institution's great credit, has made possible for generations of junior scholars. And so for me, there was constant attention to ensuring that my language skills were up to scratch for that kind of work. If you're going to be reading serious and often quite theoretical work in a second or third language, you do need to bring your A game, and you need to be able to devote the time and energy to refining those tools well beyond the standards that might be helpful in everyday life, and well beyond the standards that will get you brownie points in other circumstances. And so, having committed myself in that regard, I then sought to use other languages through both my graduate degrees and then into my academic career. I think one of the points, though, that I just want to land on here, Sophie, is that maintaining these kinds of skills is a real commitment and investment, and it's one that within even our own academic communities, we don't necessarily always focus on in quite the right way, because so many of our incentives are so short term, ultimately transactional, and focused therefore on doing just enough to get by. And if I think now of how I'm situated, particularly in an academic leadership role, this is something that requires structural attention within our universities and beyond. Otherwise, what we'll find is that those who have made those commitments ultimately have them fade away because the incentives just aren't there to remain at the tip of the spear. And I can see Alison and Cameron nodding along and really keen to get their thoughts on this, because they are at the point in their careers where they're needing to, I think, make some quite important decisions about how it is that they utilise their highly specialised skills to do useful things in the real world. Alice, over to you.
I might jump. Thanks, Nick. I might respond to one piece of this, and I'll tether it to this question that's just come in about how we could give advice to people considering learning a language for the first time. It might be helpful to share my experience when I went into Burmese. I'd come into the ANU with advanced-ish level Chinese. I'd done it through high school. I'd had a year of immersion in Beijing, so I could work in the language reasonably well, and I wanted to add to that. I started doing Burmese kind of halfway through my studies. I think I was a third year out of a 5-6 year degree. I came into honours with rudimentary Burmese language skills. Like I was mostly self-taught. I'd done I think I'd done one summer period that was not really a program. It was just a one-on-one with a tutor in country. And so I was very conscious that I was performing kind of well under par for, the extremely high standards we have at the ANU for language study. And I guess the lesson from that is, I ended up producing a high quality thesis and bringing some good insights from that language study, but it was an enormous risk to take. And I think it paid off because of the way that I framed my research. So all of the research that I did for that thesis was using archives. And the nice thing about dealing with written language is you can do it at your own pace, in your own time. You can also choose the scope and confine it accordingly. Whereas, you know, interviews I found much more intimidating because I was doing those unsupported with a translator, and there's much more room for error there. So I think that would be my piece, just be really strategic about how you want to use that original language research, and adapt as you go. Like Nick supervised that thesis, so he was more has probably more insights to share with how effective that turned out. But yeah, I think there's more flexibility than you know for how you integrate those skills.
Happy to piggyback off Alice's comments there. I think first to engage with what Nick was saying about what are the structural incentives we're giving students today to learn languages. And I think the answer to that is not enough incentives. I think my experience having just finished university and going to the job market is I don't think that employers have kept pace with government policy in terms of incentivizing particularly Asian language study. So you'll find lots of scholarships from government and foundations encouraging study in Asia, but not necessarily that translating to like selection criteria in graduate programs and stuff like that. So I think the market hasn't necessarily stayed abreast of that, which makes it difficult, right? Because if you're trying to stand out, you know, perhaps language skills in generalist jobs are not necessarily recognized. So I think that's a challenge as well. But I think also, as we've all sort of discussed, having languages early, not only in the classroom, but just in the types of literature and culture that we're digesting, like rather than Netflix, you know, just all being American movies. I think as we start listening to more music and watching more movies and eating, you know, as we have more multicultural cuisine and stuff, I think that's where we sort of pique people's interest in languages. In terms of sort of the original question about how has language informed my career, well, I'm probably in the first year of my career. So what I can tell you is like language played a very significant part. And I think the reason language played a significant part is because language sort of guided me and encouraged me to go on exchange and to seek out opportunities at university. In particular, I think there's an incredibly transformative being overseas and being able to speak a language just provides you with such a plethora of experiences you just can't access if you can't speak the language. When I was on exchange in Indonesia, I really sort of had a lot of self-actualization happen because, you know, you're in a completely different context and you're left to your own devices. And I think that self-actualization made me realize how much I really value learning about other cultures and using other cultures as a prism to understand myself. So I think that made me want to work in international relations, whatever that kind of entails. But I do think that, languages do open up a lot of opportunities to travel the world and to do interesting things.
Can I jump back in? I've worked out what the question is from Cameron's comment. I'm sorry, I got dramatically kicked off my own computer by my internet just before, so I've just logged back in. But what you were saying, Cameron, about languages and being immersed in other cultures as being a new way to sort of understand yourself and a prism through which to understand yourself. That's really beautifully put and completely my experience as well. So the question was, how has language learning informed our career?
It's a question about whether your research interest came from your language skills or if you sort of had your research interest and then felt you needed to learn the language to be able to then, you know, do your research.
Right. Yeah. Oh, I didn't miss a question. I felt like I was gone for so long. Everything was the language for me. Everything flowed on from a love of the language. And people ask me, because I work on multiculturalism and immigration and racism and all kinds of kind of cultural conflict and tensions in the French-speaking world, they ask me, you know, how did you come to this material? And I have to admit that, you know, it first came from a really idealized, stereotypical very feminized, cliched view of France that I got in my childhood through Madeline and Amelie, and like that's where it started for me. I'm not embarrassed to admit it to my students because I know that's where it started for a lot of my students as well. And so it was that sort of romanticized. I was obsessed with Impressionism, and I wanted to learn all about Montmartre from like the turn of the century, and started with that idealized, romanticized view, and then just followed the language for as long as I could. So all through school, although I was like Leslie, I wasn't, an A+ student all the way through high school at all, possibly less than a credit and distinction average student than Leslie. Followed it through uni. Did honours. It wasn't until I discovered my honours supervisor, Andrew McGregor, who worked on contemporary French cinema, that something else really clicked for me. And I just sort of, the research and the cultural inquiry came out of that love of the language. And so I started to experiment with different careers that I could possibly go into, discovered I didn't have the discipline for translation, was interested in education, but also wanted to write. And so that was why I applied for a PhD. And then it all kind of took care of itself from there.
With all of our panelists, you've all had experiences. You've mentioned working in country, as well as now based in Australia. I'm curious what you think the value is for non-native speakers to be doing research on another language. Have you ever felt like there's an attitude against non-native speakers undertaking cultural or social research? Is that something you've faced? And if so, how have you overcome that?
I once had a French professor at my first conference in the first year of my PhD, after I'd just given my first conference paper in French about the ways in which contemporary cinema represented racial divides and sort of conflicts between immigration and native, in air quotes, French people. Stand up and say, well, who are you to say such a thing? You're not French. And that was a really sobering moment for me, but also just a very, very motivating moment as well. And it really sparked a fascinating conversation in the panel itself, because there were people who sort of spoke back to this woman saying, well, actually coming in with a foreign perspective on another culture is actually extremely valuable. It gives you the sort of cultural distancing to step back and interact with cultural issues from a more balanced standpoint. And some of the best work on Australian cinema is coming out of the US and France, and that's part of the beauty of transcultural dialogue is we learn from each other. And so it's happened before, but pretty rarely. And when it does, it's usually just a jumping off point for a really interesting discussion.
I think if I can kick off the sort of Asia continent side of things, what I'm always extremely conscious of is the privilege that I'll get to study a language as a non-heritage speaker. And so I was able to do Chinese and Burmese both under really generous scholarships in ways where the diaspora could not. And for me, that created a really high standard that I felt the need to perform to, not only because of those challenges of access and those asymmetries of access, but the sort of asymmetries of expectation where we've all seen when non-heritage speakers say, some sort of clumsy, clunky words in Chinese or other languages, it's massively celebrated, where when a heritage speaker does in a similar fashion, they're derided for not being able to speak well. So for me, that just meant it was an incentive to just work really hard. And I definitely don't speak anywhere near as well as a heritage speaker could, but it's definitely a motivator to be really thoughtful about that opportunity and the level of focus that you should bring to your study.
Yeah, and I think to piggyback off of what Alice was saying, I think also being aware of like the histories and legacies of colonialism and those asymmetries and epistemologies, and a lot of countries like Australia have been the people writing the history of a lot of Southeast Asian countries or America and stuff. And I think being aware of that is important. And so I think bringing humility to your work is very important. My experience with a lot of Australians overseas is that they don't realize that being Australian isn't a neutral thing. You know, we like to think of ourselves as like perhaps like very easygoing, chill people, like, oh, you know, we're very easy to get along with, we must be pretty neutral in the world, and that what we think is actually non-ideological. But I think it's really important to be aware that Australians are not culturally neutral. That we don't even, I keep discovering things that are sort of cultural assumptions that I've just picked up over my life. And I think being really self-aware of those things when you're doing your research or working in overseas countries is incredibly important, because having an awareness of that humility makes sure that you're listening and you're not making assumptions about what other people mean. And really sort of taking the region as you find it rather than imposing your own kind of thoughts onto the region.
Yeah, just to quickly jump in then, Sophie, I think that Cameron's point that he then fleshed out around humility is just an outstanding foundation for how it is that we engage cross-culturally. And if you're serious about learning a language or languages, what does that mean in practice? It means a lot of time listening and a great deal of time reading. I don't think there's any alternative to those two modes of engagement. And if you're doing it right, that means that you are, for quite a long time at least, unlikely to be contributing so much to the conversation, and you need to be comfortable with that. You need to be patient. You need to appreciate that you will sit in many discussions, and at best you might get 80, and on your wonderful days, 90% of what's going on, and there will be that gap. And it's in that gap, of course, that you're making your own notes, you're pushing yourself to appreciate some of the subtleties, you're noting that there are things that even after many years of struggling with a language, you're still actually trying to absorb and then respond to instinctively. And to do that, I think, is just a very human practice. And we all start out, of course, with our mother tongue language learning in exactly these kinds of modes, and yet the arrogance of adulthood often eliminates that. And I think that's quite a sad thing. And for those of us engaging cross-culturally, it does mean that there will be those awkward moments where we may have been too firm or somehow missed the point or indeed caused offence. And in my experience, at least, while it's not always easy, those are moments for, yes, greater understanding and indeed for apology, for a genuine sorriness around how it is that you might have misunderstood what was going on. And certainly some of what I've learned in foreign language contexts that still burns deeply into me comes from exactly those periods where I've got it wrong, and you learn a huge amount when you're tested in those ways.
I think it's such an interesting consideration. And one thing that you have all brought up is, the impact of your time spent in country. Obviously, 2021, the possibility for international travel is severely restricted. I'm wondering whether you think that, in-country learning is the only way to really, attain that fluency and that cultural heritage, or whether that's something that you think that, in today's online connective world, that is something can be attained. I know, Gemma and Leslie, you recently co-wrote a paper about how COVID has impacted your online teaching. If there's any insights you can share about how we can still seek for that cultural understanding even online.
Well, in some ways, the move to doing everything online has opened up that world in a way, has made language learning accessible in a different way, and in a way that we're not necessarily accustomed to. So I would not have necessarily thought 5-10 years ago of trying to reconnect with my old Vietnamese teacher in Hanoi. But now there's no reason, in fact, I should make a note of this and put this into action. There's no reason I shouldn't be with her like weekly, getting my Vietnamese back up to a certain level, because it has slipped in recent years. But you know, it's something that we can very easily do now. At least if we have access to people, if we know native speakers, we can very easily set up these intimate learning one-on-one environments that don't require in-country study. I mean, in a way, it can't be matched. You know, there is something about being in country and immersing yourself in these moments of confusion, in these moments of cultural mistranslation, and going through those horrifically embarrassing experiences, which lead to greater understanding and greater humility, which I think I just want to say too is an enormous part of it. But now, given how adept we all are at living online, we should, I mean, there's certainly a whole new set of opportunities that are manifesting before us, so we should take advantage of them.
The key word that you used there, Leslie, immersion, is so important for this question. When we talk about the linguistic benefits of being in country, we're talking about that experience of being thrown in the deep end, really, of not having your, you know, native language to fall back on necessarily, of being thrown into academic but also practical everyday environments where you need to use your language, and the sort of spark of progress that occurs when you have no other choice but to interact in that language. But you know, that said, sometimes some of our students go on exchange to really strongly English speaking places like Montreal or Paris, and if they don't make a concerted effort to stay in French, they can, you know, meet up with other exchange students or English speakers in their university, and it's easy to create a little English speaking bubble. So, you know, being in a foreign country, if you don't have that really, you know, if you don't make that concerted effort to speak in the language and to expose yourself to those scenarios, you know, the language progress doesn't necessarily even occur. So, you know, online isn't the same, but at the same time, it also opens up cultural bridges and opportunities for accessibility that we didn't have before. So it's all to do with your attitude. But it makes me think of a conference that Leslie and I organised as the Australian Society for French Studies Committee at the end of last year. Normally that conference occurs in an Australian university in person. And, you know, even though most of the attendees are located in Australia, there's always a small international cohort. And a lot of us, like Leslie, are from, you know, other countries originally. But we didn't realize until we went online because of COVID how many people had not been able to attend the conference beforehand. So those who were not yet in a permanent position, who were teaching casually, you know, who may, you know, often had a PhD and were, you know, wonderful researchers with lots to contribute, just hadn't had the money to travel to Sydney or Melbourne every year and pay the, you know, $200 registration fee, which we waived last year. And we also had attendees apply from universities around the world, in Africa and in the Middle East and in Asia, that are underfunded and don't provide you know, travel scholarships for researchers to fly to Australia for a conference. And so the conference was smaller in the sense that we couldn't do the same number of collegial things, but it was completely opened up to these attendees that haven't been able to access it before, and that was really exciting.
I have a really old school point, which is kind of the antithesis to the virtual expansion, which is, you know, how can you be really creative about what's right in front of you? And it's kind of obvious that it's thinking about these sources of community and micro immersion that might exist in your own town. I'm sure we've all got stories, but a really good friend of mine learnt fluent Mandarin from working in a Chinese restaurant for a few years. So it's thinking about those little micro examples where there's probably more in front of you than you realize when you're sort of encouraged to reconsider what's in your immediate neighborhood.
Yeah, I'll just elaborate a little bit on what Alice mentioned. I think I try to be incredibly optimistic about the lack of travel, because I do think we can like fall into these traps of, you know, being very pessimistic. And there is a lot of opportunity to keep learning language, as Alice said. I think like one thing that I've been doing, because I'm going back to uni next year to do research, and my supervisor says she'll only supervise me if I do it in Indonesian. So the fire is under my butt right now. I've been like, on my morning coffee, I listen to an Indonesian podcast, like SBS Bahasa Indonesia. It's the news. I already know what the news is, so I've kind of got it primed in the back of my head. Just listen to that every morning. And it's just those lockdown friendly habits you can start doing on a day-to-day basis to improve and to try and immerse. But secondly, I think like and I suppose this is a bit of a pitch of the stuff that I kind of do. There's so many amazing youth run communities that bring together typically international students and Australians in Australia to share culture and to practice language. So my organisation is the ASEAN Australia Strategic Youth Partnership, but likewise, you know, the Australia Indonesia Youth Association, the Australia China Youth Association. All of these types of associations do really, really good work in bringing people together, because the best way you can learn is meeting someone, talking with them. There's no reason why you can't go to one of these events and make some friends and then just like hassle them on WhatsApp or WeChat or whatever the platform is and getting them to talk with you on the phone. I think my Indonesian friends are sick of me randomly calling them, being like, hi, apa kabar, and then just like striking up a conversation. But I suppose like that's the beauty of languages, right? Like people are very generous with their time if you're generous back. So seek out those communities because they exist and they want you to, they want your membership fee.
Just a quick follow on then from Cameron's insights there, and perhaps speaking somewhat awkwardly, from Tasmania, a fortress within a fortress under pandemic conditions, there will come a time sooner rather than later when our borders have returned to something a bit more familiar. And there's going to, in my judgment, be a big responsibility on all of us to be getting the right kind of international connections flowing early on in that re-engagement phase. And this is something that we can't imagine is going to happen by accident. And so I think those who are listening or watching this session right now and who are studying languages, and it doesn't matter which language, focused on which part of the world, do be seriously thinking through how you might plan under these inelegant conditions to get yourself overseas and to therefore be part of an early wave of Australian re-engagement on the other side of the pandemic. This isn't necessarily going to be something that is available or straightforward in 2022, but hopefully in the years to come, we can all be supporting talented young Australian language learners to get out and spend time on the ground at a moment when, of course, we also will need to further appreciate the kind of privilege that we're bringing to those interactions, because so many of the countries whose languages we devote ourselves to learning have had such a grim time over the last few years. And so appreciating that without having experienced it ourselves, I think is going to be something that needs to be worked through, because as Cameron was just highlighting, it is the generosity of other people that allows all of us to develop language aptitude. And as part of these kinds of conversations over the decade to come, we're going to need to perhaps more fully appreciate the Australian situation and how it is that we all engage in these kinds of conversations after what we appreciate has just been a horrendous time for so many people in so many places.
I think that is such an important thing, is that, you know, as we've discussed, language learning isn't something that just happens. It's a continual process. And so it's about building those foundations now, and so that in the future, when things start to return to some kind of normalcy, we can make sure that that normal is better than what we left off. I just now, we've got a couple of Q&As coming through, but if you do have any more, please do send them through. First question that we have is, how can we turn a love for languages into a career without going into language teaching? Any thoughts? We have a variety of panelists working in very different industries without necessarily teaching. So I'd love to hear, some experiences potentially from Alice or Cameron. Neither of you working in academia at the moment. You're both working in very different sectors. Any insights to share?
Cameron told me I had to go first if we got asked this question. So I'll take it for the team. I think the first thing is just as a bit of expectation management is that unfortunately, in most cases, your language skills and your investment into them will not be recognized by most employers. I'm very fortunate that mine does. I work in a consulting firm that specializes on Asian economies and Asian spaces, and we all bring a language and an Asian language to our work. So we're kind of the exception to the rule. But I think for those positions that don't really have, a language in the job description, or even as a desirable piece of the job description, you've just got to think of a way that you can really creatively assert that value in what you do, and it will come. It's just not, your employer potentially is just not cognizant of what you can bring.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that is, I think one, you've got to, if you want it to be a priority, you've got to carve out time yourself to put in the effort. Like I'm currently just do like 4 hours a week of classes online, just because my employer won't fund me to do that. And so I think making it a personal priority in your life is important. And I think secondly, my understanding, and this is not the area I'm in, but if you are working in bigger organizations like multinational to transnational organizations, if you carve out an identity where you make very clear to your supervisors and managers that you have an interest in the region or that country that you do have an interest in, those opportunities can arise. Like I think that we can all be quite active architects in our own destiny by letting that be known. And I have had a lot of friends, who work for consulting firms and stuff like that, who then end up going to Vietnam or Indonesia or other places because of that capability. So don't sit on it. Let people know. Be passionate about your country, because that can breed opportunity.
The other thing to consider is that there are a number of research-oriented careers that don't involve teaching the language. So we encounter this a lot when we're speaking to undergrads who, in trying to sell adding languages to their degree, when it's not always necessarily part of a degree program. So why would a scientist study French? Why would a marine biologist, for example, want to pursue French? And so it's about thinking creatively about where your research career might take you, what context, what opportunities, what postdocs, what organizations you could work for. I mean, I tell people that, in the Pacific region, there are so many ways to bring marine biology and French together. You just got to be creative. Or if you're in international development, Africa is where French is, the majority of French speakers are now increasingly in Africa. So there are ways to pursue that work or that research in other contexts and make use of your language and not have to teach it.
I also have a lot of students who, oh, sorry, Leslie, were you going to say something else?
I was just going to say, not that teaching it is a bad thing.
Yeah, I love teaching the language. But I also have lots of students who go on to work directly using their language. Like I have one who, I think I've put this in the chat here, I'm not sure if it's visible to everybody, but one of my students went through, did a law degree and now works for the UN in Switzerland. And so French is not only the main language spoken in Geneva, but it's also a diplomatic language. And opens up all of those kinds of opportunities. I've got another one who works for the Department of Environment for the Australian government, advising on relationships between Australia and the French Pacific, because he did his honours degree on New Caledonian climate change issues. I've got students that go on to work for film festivals, for museums, for all kinds of different, even consulting firms, that's work that travels. And their language was an asset when they were interviewing for their positions, and they use it. So it's not often on a dot point on the job ad, but it is something that is recognised in many contexts.
I think that's a great point that Gemma's made, Sophie. having spent a lot of time sitting on selection committees for this, that, and the other, anytime that somebody declares an international interest or ambition, of course, I'm excited to hear that. I'm even more excited, though, if they're backing it up with the real deal investment in something like a language. There are other ways of making that investment, but I think language, as we all agree around this Zoom room, is probably the best, because those who have studied a language appreciate what's at stake. You can see in somebody else, even the way that our French researching and teaching colleagues in this room are talking about their exposure to that language, a language that I haven't learned, but I totally get it. I can feel the passion all the way down here in Hobart, and that's, I think, what we all look for in those who want to have an internationally focused career, or who are seeking, perhaps like the marine biologists or the mining engineers or the management consultants, you name it. All of those people can bluntly have a much more exciting life if they have some other language to rub against their technical skills. And that means that they're going to go off to cooler places, meet more exciting people, and basically get away with doing wilder stuff because they can do it more safely, more often, and walk away with some great stories. And that's something that I think actually, within the context of living a full, exciting, purposeful life, we all look for that when we're hiring staff or building teams or whatever it might be. So that's where I think we need to start looking at languages in that framing, because it's a great signaling device. And so for students, signal yourself.
Well, now that we know all the amazing opportunities that can come from languages, I feel like for our final question coming in from the QA, it's a good place to think about the beginnings of your language journey. And if you could give one piece of advice to someone who is either currently starting to learn a language or is considering learning a language, what's something that now, on the other side of fluency with, a career in languages, what's something that you wish you knew way back when you were beginning?
Oh, I have one. I was actually going to volunteer it, so I'm glad you asked. I was going through school at a time where everyone was really fixated on like the big countries and the big power shifts going on, right? So I was one of many people who were encouraged to study Chinese because of how vast the sort of speaking community is. And I'm glad I did it, but not for that reason. I don't think it's that compelling to study a language just because it's got a massive speaking community and it's big and important and economically significant. I think that's the wrong reason, and the people I know who started languages for that reason have not stuck with them. I would really push everyone here to think about going the other way, go real niche. Like the fact that I, am somewhat proficient in Burmese has unlocked actually more sort of interesting job and travel opportunities than Chinese ever has, because it's just such an unusual mix, or it's an unexpected one for what I do. So don't be afraid to choose a language that feels numerically less significant. I think you'll find it'll pay off massively.
I'll jump in, and I think echoing some of the other panelists, when I started my language, I was in my first few years. I had done a little bit in primary school, but then came to uni and started, and was not a particularly good student. I was very excited by all the new opportunities that university provided. So I definitely didn't focus very much. I would say when you're starting out with your language, my tips would be to focus and to just habitually revise. Because my first 2 years of my Indonesian education were a little bit fraught and inconsistent, it made picking it up later actually a bit more difficult when I was back in country and like really focused on it, because I just didn't have the foundations right. So take the time to get the foundations right, because those foundations will hold you in good stead throughout your life as you come back to your language and go through waves of engagement with it.
I would also suggest that, when starting a new language, your decision to choose that language should come from a place of genuine interest and curiosity, rather than, as Alice said, choosing a language because you think it's strategic or important. It's just not a reason to do it. And learning a language is actually, really hard, and I'm sure none of us would pretend otherwise. But if you have that drive to either, spend time in the countries that that language is spoken, or to learn more about the cultures, if you're interested in the literature, or you want to unravel the politics of a region, and language would be a way for you to unlock that, series of cultures and places. That's what will give you the motivation and the drive to continue when it's hard with the language. And so, French is one of those languages like Chinese that's, one of the global lingua francas. And sometimes we do have people who choose it because they think it would be good to have on their list of things that they've done for that reason. And often those people don't continue on to higher levels. But we have so many students who come to the language because they've got a personal interest in it for one reason or another. And that's what really makes the difference for people between doing, a couple of semesters and carrying through to fluency.
I think just adding on that, I would say remember that it's a long-term and multifaceted process. It's not something you do at uni. It's something you do for the rest of your life. And so, and this goes back to a comment that Nick made earlier about, what I took to be a relative sort of undervaluing of the ongoing work that we need to do to stay on the tip of the sphere, as you put it, but that you've got to look for ways to continue deepening, widening your knowledge. And that might mean reading a novel in English from that country until you can get to reading it in that language, just so that you're learning about the culture, just so that you're discovering the history and the ways in which they see the world in that language, in that culture, but also pushing for opportunities to develop your linguistic capacity and pursuing those opportunities, both in terms of going overseas, but the more mundane things around you, the communities around you, the people that looking for the opportunities near and far, over a very long period of time.
Just quickly and finally then, Sophie, I think that what we've heard around the room highlights what's at stake here. That this is such an amazing journey that we can choose to go on, but it is a choice. You can't force somebody to absorb a language. That's unrealistic. And I think some of the examples here highlight how if you're learning a language simply because it's one of the official languages of the UN or what have you, you're unlikely to maintain momentum beyond about 18 months, which is, I think for many of us, the point at which learning a language becomes really hard. You've met some of those early plateaus, and you then need to either do it seriously and for the super long term, or you basically opt out at that point. And I think that's something that's worth being really upfront about, because getting into those higher levels of aptitude and insight does bring extra rewards. And so, we all start off at the beginning with hello and how are you and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And I know myself watching small children do exactly that right now in Japanese, a language that I myself have never studied. It's an amazing thing. And so I suppose recognizing that child in all of us, it's important to know that we have to keep learning. And if you're going to be learning languages and they're going to take you somewhere, you need to keep some of that curiosity, I think, about the world, about sound, about scribbles on a page, because that's what makes it all so just exciting to be part of.
I think that is a beautiful message to end on. I think definitely what has come across today is the way that languages can just entirely change your perspective and open up so many opportunities, and that what is important is to just have that curiosity and to think, from the beginning to the end of your journey, there's so many places languages can take you, and it's just important to keep on learning and make the investment. So thank you so much to our panelists for joining us today. Thank you for being so open and sharing your insights. I know I definitely have a lot to think about. I think I need to crack open some textbooks. But thank you so much for joining us. And thank you also to the audience for coming and participating. And thank you for your questions.